and welcome to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies, a podcast where our international fellows discuss the most pressing issues of today that we're all facing and share their exciting research ideas. We hope you enjoy today's talk. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you very much, Kiran, and thank you everybody for being here, particularly to those who were here after last week, because that really worked great for my self-esteem. So, not joking. So, thank you very much for being here, and thank you to the AIS for hosting me and for arranging everything and for treating me so well during these days. Last week, I did a workshop that was mainly methodological and introductory in scope. So this week, I will try to speak more about the content of the thesis and the postdoctoral work I've been trying to carry out. First of all, I wanted to briefly introduce to my framework, my academic trajectory, so you could understand a little bit where I came from and why something interests me and from what point of view. So I studied journalism. So it's a pretty weird trajectory, you will see. I studied journalism at the Pompeu Fabra University. Then I did my PhD in philosophy with a public Spanish contract at the University of Barcelona. I did my PhD on arts and politics in the work of Hannah Höch. Funny anecdote, during my PhD, I was doing a PhD research stay here with Marcia Mestimun, the former director of the IES, and that's why I'm here now. So really happy to be back. And I was also in contact and in the frame of the Philosophy and Gender Seminar, which is a seminar that has been reading like for 30 years women philosophers and had a lot of interesting methodological approaches to this. Then I've been like trying to broaden my research, but this has been really determined, as you may suppose, by the different kinds of funding I was securing, because basically the postdoctoral period is a strange path to the search for funding. So some of that explains mostly of my different directions. And then now I'm teaching at ENA University, which is a design university in which I teach kind of the theoretical things like visual communication, drawing on my journalistic background, or art history. And then I also teach humanities in an online university. And now I'm like the director. I'm the director because it's not so such thing institutionally. I'm the director of a working group on history of political thought, social history of political thought at the Philosophy Society of Catalonia, in which we basically work from the point of view of history of thought with Marxist authors. So this is my trajectory, and I only want to focus on two particular outcomes because they basically form the basis of the primary sources I want to share with you today. So the first outcome would be this book in Spanish, Two Women with Cat, and it's a book translating with Isabel Garcia Adanez, who is a really great and experienced translator in Spain from German. And we translated some of the writings by Hannah Höch and Märten. I will speak about them. And we basically gathered these texts. Some of them weren't translated or weren't edited even in German at that time. And it was a really great experience. And for me, it was like the most important thing that I did with my PhD thesis, because I believe that the possibility to basically give people these texts in order to have them and be accessible for everybody was like my main achievement at some point. And then now I'm working, thanks to Nuria Sanchez Madrid, which is a senior Kantian researcher in Spain, in a critical edition of Rosa Luxemburg's text on art and culture. So basically, the different sources that I will bring today are a mixture of those texts I translated for this book with Isabel, and those texts I'm working in the context of Luxemburg's thought. So you will see that now I'm really like, I'm more into Luxemburg in the sense that I'm really stuck with the translation of Luxemburg than with the text of Hannah. So everything started with Hannah Höch, and she's also the starting point of my chat today. As you may know, Hannah Höch is a really well-known artist. She's mainly known because of her photomontage during interwar Berlin. But she also had like miniatures, embroidery, painting, and she was really engaged with a lot of different movements and artistic spaces. So she was a really heterodox and heterogeneous artist from a lot of points of view. And also what I was trying to do with my thesis that basically engaged and addressed to Hannah Höch's writings, because I mean I wasn't an art historian, and I read a lot on Hannah Höch, and also that mainly people had approached it from the point of view of visual culture or art history, but maybe these writings, at least in the Anglo context and also in the Spanish context, were not so well known. So I decided to basically focus on the thought that was inscribed in these writings. And what it struck me is that I could find a lot of normative concerns that I also found in feminist art history or in social history. So this main idea of social or feminist art history, of basically questioning the way in which art history canon is produced, and different concerns that were common in this text, for me, there were just as intuitions in Hannah Höch's text. Some of them are, for example, the critique of the genius as a suprasocial subject that deals with transhistorical matters, this idea that artists are basically people who respond to transhistorical questions and are basically above the reality and above the mediocrity of the rest. Also, the focus on the material conditions of art production and transmission. So this relevance and this stress on the idea that we should focus on how art is produced in order to understand why some artists have success or why some artists are not successful, etc., etc. Also, in this sense, attention to how women and their creative activities, women and of course other subjects, but in the case of her, she was more interested in the particular case of women, and their creative activities were often excluded from the artistic canon. And this also has always, a link with art and crafts and the way in which basically women engaged in these more feminized activities that were not taken in consideration in the same way as men's activities were taken in consideration, at least not by the canon, even if the society at that time did take them in consideration or not. And then this idea that interests me a lot, particularly to link it with Luxemburg, is the idea of art as a social practice, right? This idea of art as not a mere reflection of reality or mere reflection of the will of a genius, but art as a social practice, as a way of social interacting between each other that is therefore capable of enabling social change. Because if we acknowledge that art is a social practice, then we can see how art can at some point transform reality, right? And sometimes this besides artist ideas. So this idea that sometimes an artist does not have the intention of changing everything or of transforming reality or to be feminist, but then because of these conditions of production and transmission, at the end of the day, these ideas, this set of ideas can really perform something different. So these concerns for me also emerge in some of Lou Märten texts. I get to Märten because Hannah Höch did write to her, so I was like in Hannah Höch archive exploring the people in which to whom she had contact, and then I found these socialist theorists, Lou Märten, who also you can see that as Hannah Höch was really long lived, so they had a huge life experience. In the case of Hannah Höch, we used to think like First World War, Second World War, Cold War. So they were like people who had really different experiences of the stage in which art and culture were in many different contexts. And I really find also these concerns in Lou Märten text. And also all of this could be tracked back to Rosa Luxemburg, because as you may know, Rosa Luxemburg was one of the most important revolutionary thinkers and one of the founders of the Polish Communist and Social Democrat Party, and one of the main faces of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, and then of the split at the KPD after the war. I will try to delve in later. So if you feel lost, it will be clarified. But basically, we can trace not only a relationship between their ideas in the sense that we find like common concerns in these different texts, but also a historical relationship, right? So Hannah Höch had a relationship with Märten, and then Märten was very fond of Rosa Luxemburg, and in fact, Märten really get to work with Clara Zetkin, who was one of the main comrades of Rosa Luxemburg. So if we wanted to do so, we could also trace a historical relationship between them. So for me, these three thinkers are also at some point representative, or at least could be classified in three different moments of German history, or in three different trends of ways of thinking around the relationship between art and politics. Rosa Luxemburg would be more representative of a social democratic party before the First World War that was more interested in thinking of the way in which capitalist economy affected the production of culture, and interested in the way in which, for example, great German authors should be transmitted to working classes. So the idea of how should we approach Schiller, for example, or Goethe, in order to workers to fully understand or fully grasp the things that are at stake in these others. Also, Märten would be more representative, and of course, this is a huge simplification of everything for the sake of communication. Märten would be more representative of SPD tradition, so the same party as Rosa Luxemburg and KPD tradition, but a tradition that tries to face the avant-garde and try to face what's happening with Dadaism, for example. So all these people who are questioning what art is. If you think about Dadaism, you may be familiar with Duchamp, for example, and the ideas of anti-art and ready-mades that really challenged the way in which art was conceived. So Märten would be more representative of a tradition that either rejecting this novelty would try to approach to this novelty and understand what was happening. And then Hannah Höch will be representative of the power of this avant-garde that at the early 20th century started to questioning the way in which art was functioning. Of course, there are a lot of nuances, but we could see this narrative, right? If we read the secondary literature. And we could see also how these different positions fight with each other in different moments of German history. Before continuing, I would like just to say where you can find the works of these people, in case you're interested. So Rosa Luxemburg works in German are fully, or at least almost fully, without some Polish text and some letters, digitized in German. But also you could see that complete works of Rosa Luxemburg are already being translated into English. So they are trying to translate everything, but there is a lot of things. So there are some volumes, but not everything. And then Märten's archives are at the Akademie der Künste in Berlin, but also in Amsterdam at the International Institute of Social History. And you would find Hannah Höch mainly in the Berlinische Galerie in Berlin. And if you go to the website, to the Berlinische Galerie, you will be able to search and to do word search and find some of the letters not translated into English, but digitized in order to translate them. So we have these three tendencies, but we cannot understand these tendencies without thinking about the historical context, because these texts or these authors were basically not doing arguments in the vacuum, but trying to answer concrete questions that were posed by historical events. In the case of the fight or the controversies between the first and the second trend, the pre-war SPD and the afterward SPD and Communist Party, we should mention for basically their fight over the approbation of the war credits. So basically Luxemburg and other colleagues, when the SPD was in favor of going to the war, to the First World War, they split. They say, okay, we don't have anything to do with these people because we are pacifists and we are absolutely anti the militaristic trend of the party. So we don't want to do anything about it. There are a lot of different small splits. We can talk about it later if you have questions. But also, this is marked by the idea that this first tendency, so the official line of the party, was really influenced by Lenin and the Russian Revolution. And in terms of reception, we see that Luxemburg, so our interest author, is portrayed as it was more resistance or reluctant to Lenin as it really was. So she really became a symbol of the opposition against the authoritarianism of Lenin and the Russian Revolution. So you could see Luxemburg having like a more anarchist pedigree than other authors, even if this wasn't true. And then if we think about the relationship between the party and the avant-garde, so the different small and heterogeneous groups that emerged at the early 20th century and question art history from really different points of view, we could mention, for example, the Dada Fair of 1920, the political theater by Erwin Piscator and Bertolt Brecht, the Bauhaus, and a lot of different fightings that basically put a conflict between those who were defending classicist positions and basically were defending the importance of transmitting the bourgeois cultural legacy. So this idea that we, as a nation, as a culture, we have great authors, and the most important thing in terms of social emancipation when it comes to culture is transmitting these authors to the masses, so show how great these authors they are. And we had another trend opposing that, which is the anti-art trend posed by the avant-garde, saying basically, hey guys, all of this is bullshit. Look where we are. We are after the First World War, so let's stop speaking about these great authors who basically drove us to the First World War, and let's try to do something new. Of course, this is everything really simplified, but depending on who you read, you could find like this discussion. What I want to argue, explaining to you or showing to you these sources, is that we can find a tradition in this with these women, but with also other authors, of this radical criticism to the way in which art and culture were functioning, but without a complete nihilism or a complete rejection of the art of the past. Yes, so my point would be that Rosa Luxemburg, Märten, and Hannah Höch, from really different trajectories and points of view, share a common idea of a necessary critique to the established order that is much in tune with the avant-garde critique, but they also embrace the tradition, or at least the critical acknowledgement of the tradition, right? And also we can find with this whole analysis these different premises that we were talking about before. So the first text I would like to show you, and it's a text that I always show because for me it was like the thing that made me start studying Höch, is the Mahler, the painter, which is an unpublished fiction story of Hannah Höch, in which basically Hannah Höch tells about a painter who has a spiritual crisis because his woman, his wife, wants him to wash the kitchen dishes. So he doesn't understand anything because he's thinking, well, I'm a painter, so if I think of the great painters of the past, I didn't see Michelangelo washing the dishes. Why I have to do this weird activity? Okay, so this is the starting point of Höch history. And what we see in this history that, in fact, you can find translated into English in these two books, in Maud Slavin's book on Hannah Höch, and also in a catalog. And I think they are pretty accessible. What we see in the history is a mockery of the figure of the genius, the modern painter. So we see this first premise, this idea of criticizing the way in which the creative process was absolutely mystified, right? And also we see how this genius, how this modern painter establishes a hierarchy, a gender hierarchy between creative work and the social reproduction work that basically sustains this category of genius. But also, this story offers an insider critique because Hannah Höch was a Dadaist, and how Hannah Höch was sharing a lot of environments and a lot of venues with modern painters who basically embrace this idea of a genius, but secretly. So a lot of male painters were basically saying, okay, we are super progressive, we are anarchist, we are anti-art, but then when it came to their private life or their way to relate with other women, they basically treat women as they were amateurs, right? And as if they didn't have the right to paint. This is the case with Raoul Hausmann, that was Hannah Höch's partner, and that basically, apart from doing a lot of bad things to her, prevent her from painting. And we really have anecdotes of him trying to lock her to make her not paint, right? So, and this was an anarchist progressive painter at the time. So it offers an insider critique of both this idea of modern artists and also the database. We have this really nice text of Rosa Luxemburg in which she's basically criticizing this idea of history of culture as a succession of individual achievements. So she was really well versed in nature science. So she liked it to go to the empirical evidence and to the scientific evidence. And she basically says, okay, with the scientific evidence that we have, we cannot say that the history is just a succession of individuals doing things that are great at some point. We must say that everything good that has been achieved throughout history has been done with the collaboration of the big mass of people. So everything that we know is a collective work, right? Here you have a quote of this text. What is the essence of human culture that which distinguishes humans from the rest of the animal world? Language, working with tools of their own making, art. For all these distinctive characteristics of human existence would be unthinkable without the constant social participation of the masses. So we see how Luxemburg, from her point of view of history of culture, is basically also challenging this narrative of solitary individuals looking for food, right? So we can also link this text of the painter with the friendship that Hannah Höch had with Märten. They sent letters to each other, and they also were together in fancy dress parties. So really their relationship also raises the question of authorizing these informal spaces of knowledge production, and see how political and artistic arguments at the time were also produced in parties, right? And not only in thick books written by solitary people. And we also have these both characteristics in some of Märten's texts. If we go to another unpublished short story by Hannah Höch, we find Julie. Julie is the story of a young woman who moves to Berlin, to the big city. She's basically from outside and knows nothing about the urban life and anything. And she discovers her artistic facet, her artistic dimension through engraving and through crafts, basically, and not through art. So what Hannah Höch does with this story is, on the one side, continue mocking this figure of the genius and continue mocking the idea on how art is conceived by the modern painters, but also she puts the ability, the possibility of creating something in a woman, which was not so common in the narratives, for example, of the 19th century at that time. We can also link this story to Märten text. Märten was really fond of a lot of women artists of the period. So when she was a journalist, she would go to exhibitions and would talk about the woman of the exhibitions and would say, okay, we had this, for example, Käthe Kollwitz, who is a really great artist, and she is better than most of the men who are in this exhibition. So this friendship could also help to embrace the idea that women could also be creative subjects. Also, we have an interesting reference to the housing situation in Berlin. So Julie lives in an environment of absolutely economic precarity. She needs to sublet a flat. She doesn't have enough money to celebrate Christmas, for example, and decided to get married. So we can link this idea to the Künstlerin, which is a book written by Märten in 1919, in which she mentions the fact that women get married as something that could limit the possibility of women to dare to conceive themselves as creative subjects. So what we have with this story is that Julie starts talking with a man, and she basically lets her to be convinced. And I use this because it's really passive, the way in which it happens. And she gets married and she commits suicides because she feels guilty for everything. Also, we have other articles to which we could link these ideas. For example, Märten had also an article talking about the population growth on Berlin and the way in which houses were being built because of that, and the unhealthiness of the situation at all. Also, Märten had a book from 1914, so the year of the start of the Post-World War, talking about the economic situation of artists. So the way in which artists were basically suffering a really, really bad economic situation at that time. And then we have also an interesting article of 1915 in which Märten is basically saying to artists, please do ask money for what you do and don't do anything by free, because then you compromise the rights of the others, right? So she says, whatever opportunities to work each individual artist may still have, demanding compensation is their obligation, and it must be a settled fact that they work only for pay. So this concern about the situation of artists, that it's not much Hannah Höch in the sense that she was concerned of other things, could have had a lot to do also with Märten and her friendship. But if we need to think about the place in which Hannah Höch explicitly acknowledged the ability of women to be creative subjects, we should go to her articles published in Stickerei und Spitzen Rundschau, that was basically a magazine that tried to promote women's crafts at the time and to elevate crafts to the category of the fine arts, right? To promote these activities. I just will mention three of them. There are like five, at least there are no five or six. The first one is the stickende Frau, so the woman that embroiders. We have a description in a really, really brief fiction story in which we can find a woman absolutely excited with the pursuing an embroidery. But then she realizes that embroidery is the only dimension, the only facet of her life in which she can channel the creative force that she has, right? So it's like, okay, I'm doing this, but I'm doing this because I cannot do anything else. We have to think that Hannah Höch wanted to study painting at the fine arts school, but her father prevented her from doing that, and she ended up in an arts and crafts venue because it was like more useful for the marriage at that time. So she says, this fiction woman, my soul wants to write poetry, but my words are too poor. Embroidery is all I know how to do. So we can see embroidery as a place that allows the possibility of creativity in women, but also as a place that emerged as a consequence of a limitation, a structural limitation. It has like this dual approach. Also, we have another interesting text that is called What is Shown, in which basically Hannah Höch asks herself what is considered beauty. So what is beauty, which was like a question at the time. We can also find this sentence in another Märten article. We have an article of Bertolt Brecht, that is called What is Shown also. And then she basically stresses that even the cultural public, so the public who is supposed to understand art, does not know anything about how to judge art. So this allegedly cultural public knows how to say if this work is good or bad, but because they know our history. And because of our history, they can say, okay, this was good in my book, this was bad in my book. But then when it comes to contemporary art, they have no clue of it. So this was an answer of Höch against those who claims that workers should be enlightened by these people that knew more about art. And Hannah Höch just raises the question, okay, maybe you know about art history, but do you really know about art? So she says, to what extent the cultural public does understand art, it is partially true that it has learned to judge art from the past. In reality, art history, even the enlightened, don't know want anything to hear about contemporary art. So this reminds us to the very starting point in which I settled these controversies between the Weimar left and then the avant-garde artists. And we also have another article that's called On Embroidery, that I think also is translated to English in the Bristol catalog. In this article, we see how Hannah Höch basically tries to justify that embroidery should be considered as good as painting, and tries to encourage women to continue doing embroidery because it's a way of documenting her time and of being active. She says, embroidery is closely related to painting. You, craft women, women of the most modern kind, you who believe you are doing intellectual work, who so strongly defend your rights, economic and intellectual. This was the time, so suffrage in Germany was basically achieved during this period. So there were like, there was a feminist, a proto-feminist movement, who believe you have your feet firmly on the ground. At least you should know that with these embroideries, you are documenting your time. So basically what is doing, Höch is saying, okay, guys, let's take this seriously, because embroidery can be a field for creativity and should also be on the museums. And this remembered me of an interesting book of Josenia Hervás about the women of the Bauhaus. Her thesis is basically that although the project of the Bauhaus was trying to encourage architects and designers and artists to confront the idea of total space, so to do architecture, women in the Bauhaus at the very beginning were specifically relegated to bidimensionality, because they were relegated to textile venues in which they basically craft, but they couldn't be architects. So this idea that women started from bidimensionally, but achieved the total space. So for me, what Höch is trying to do with embroidery, it's something that recalls this idea. So as we see, embroidery appears as a sign of a gender limitation, but also as a space that allows criticism of art history and the free development of creativity. We have another interesting text that is really unknown. We can find the text like this, or the Spanish translation that we did. It's a public lecture for housewives that Hannah Höch did. In theory, she did it because I know that it was postponed because of a problem with the light. So I really don't know if at the end of the day Hannah Höch did the lecture or only prepared the lecture. But basically, it is really interesting because she starts. So she came from a relatively middle class bourgeois background. So she's not a working class woman. She acknowledged that material conditions prevent them from devoting time to art. So she starts basically saying, okay, I'm so sorry. I know that you are not going to be interested at all in what I say, because I know that you are absolutely overwhelmed with childcare, with your home and everything, and you don't have time to think about beauty or art or whatever. So this is the start. But tries to show them that it is really important that they try to spend some hours doing art. So she says, but I do not wish to concern myself here with the problems of what we have called art. So I don't want to talk about great painters of the past. On the contrary, I would like to show the past that allows human beings to grow and enrich themselves, so that they do not spend their hours like mere working machines trapped in the sad wheel of the routine. So Hannah Höch's idea is, okay, maybe you can just try to devote some time of your day to explore beauty in daily activities and try to engage with small creative activities. And she poses like medical arguments for it. For example, this would be good for your well-being and everything. So she really has in mind that she has a different audience. And also basically inserts the creation of beauty and the satisfaction that it brings. So this idea that when you create something, then you have this satisfaction and you get this proud of what you have done independently, if it's or not on a museum, right? Into the daily lives of housewives. And this, of course, reminds us a lot, your reading of William Morris and Arts and Crafts, and this idea of trying to insert the creation of beauty in the daily life of the workers. In fact, Hannah Höch could have known at that time William Morris, because we know that her friend Märten read William Morris and read Ruskin, which is the main reference, the main benchmark of Morris. So they really share a path of thought. So I think that it's really interesting how to see how these different traditions converge. We also have this acknowledgement of the importance of integrating life with the creation of beauty and the satisfaction that art brings. In Märten, for example, in this text, which is called Culture and Art in the Daily Life of Workers, we see how basically Märten analyzes the way in which production of everyday objects works, In Morris terms, she says, the concept of beauty does not necessarily coincide with the concept of expensive and luxurious, nor it is directly linked to property. So basically, the idea is you don't need a sort of a really expensive thing to engage with beauty, right? Art or beauty should not be something limited to an elite of people who can afford that, but should be something open to the whole population. According to Märten, basically, bourgeois art theory, sort of the theory that precedes her, the 19th century theory, had relegated beauty to something abstract. So beauty has been something abstract that has been detached from the experience of everyday life, right? So instead of thinking about beauty in terms of how we feel when we see something beautiful, how we feel when we see a flower in our daily lives, beauty has basically been relegated to a sort of obscure, abstract domain reserved for an elite of people who understand what's at stake, but we, regular people, doesn't have nothing to do with it. So consequently, artists progressively distance themselves from the masses because, they are like enclosed in this strange domain, and the masses lose the ability to appreciate art because they basically are in so separate places that they cannot talk between them. They cannot understand each other. So she links the reconciliation between art and the masses, so this future in which masses will be able to understand and to engage with art, with the need for a radical change in society for the sake of authenticity. She basically analyzes production in terms of what capitalism has done to cultural production and what the commodification of art has produced. So the reconciliation between the exploited and art basically will be overcome when this antagonism between these classes will be overcome too. But in the meantime, we must continue to explore how the link between art and people can be explored through everyday objects. So she's not rejecting the possibility of the proletarian masses to engage with art, but she's assuming that a whole big change will come when the society has a great transformation too. And this is really unknown. I believe the fun thing is that this idea that art has been detached with an elite, a bourgeois elite, and the masses are not able to understand is also in the writings of Tolstoy that Luxemburg really liked. So Luxemburg wrote a couple of articles talking about the relevance of Tolstoy's legacy in these exact terms. Basically, Luxemburg paraphrases Tolstoy and acknowledges everything that he says and says, okay, art has distanced itself from the masses and has become the entertainment of a wealthy and able minority. Only a new social organization can produce an entirely new art. So you can see that basically Tolstoy's thesis is Märten's thesis, which is at the same time Luxemburg's thesis because of her reception of Tolstoy. So in Tolstoy and in Luxemburg's thought, art is basically a way of interacting socially. So there we go. We see art as a social practice and not as the mere reflection or some conditions, or not as a result of some abstract thing that we don't understand. For Luxemburg, Tolstoy's way of thinking about art is entirely socialist, even though he was conservative and he basically hated Marx. So what is interesting about this is that we tend to see Luxemburg and socialists as really dogmatic with art and really deterministic and really hating everything new. And here we have Luxemburg reclaiming Tolstoy's legacy and say, okay, we can have a conservative writer that says nice things that need to be preserved and thought. So it's really astonishing if you come from another tradition. So for Luxemburg, the working class will only be able to create its own science and art when it has emancipated itself from its current class position. In the meantime, art should be present in the daily life. And if you see, for example, the program of the Polish social democracy that Luxemburg wrote, we see that one of the part of the programs talk about the importance of having libraries, cultural venues, and the importance of having beauty in the city, in the sense that embellish the city so workers feel that they are enlightened workers and not only mere machines, which is also a vocabulary that we link always with Morris and the way in which he hated mechanical work being relegated to those groups. So probably Luxemburg's thought about art, like Luxemburg's thought about the women's movement, has a lot to do with Clara Zetkin. So talking about friendships and the collective production of knowledge, I would say that maybe the interaction and the exchange with Clara Zetkin could have a lot to do with her vision on art. Clara Zetkin, in one of her articles in 19th century, said, the proletarian masses have already begun to rally in defense, early 20th century, sorry, in defense of art and culture, which today are still essentially the patrimony of the property. So again, this idea that basically all our notions of art are the patrimony of an elite, a bourgeois elite, but which, as the supreme trophy of the victorious proletariat, will tomorrow become the property of all. So the idea is that reclaiming this legacy of the great writers, the great thinkers of Germany, for example, is something that is really suited for the working class, because they will be the owners of the future. So they have to critically acknowledge this legacy, even if this legacy is ambivalent at some point. So we have seen how these different normative concerns arise in these different texts. The critique of the genius, in the case of the three, I have not put an example of Märten, but she basically embraces Hannah Höch's ideas. Focus on the materials conditions of art production and transmission. We have to think that basically what the Social Democrat Party and the Communist Party were doing were analyzing the production system with their Marxist lens. So the conclusion basically is that you cannot produce good art in a capitalist society in which you are urged to produce quick, fast, and bad, right? So when Märten, for example, like William Morris, analyzes workers' houses or buildings, she basically says, okay, these buildings are absolutely shitty because they needed to be fast built, they needed to be cheaper. So we need to start producing things of quality in order to workers have the possibility to embrace beauty too. And in this sense, this attention to how women and their creative activities were often excluded from the canon. Of course, Rosa Luxemburg doesn't talk about arts and crafts, but we can see, for example, texts of Luxemburg advocating for women's suffrage and saying that women were working at their homes, although this work was not considered by the capital. So basically, talking about feminist economy, the basics of feminist economy. So we have this acknowledgement of activities that were not formally recognized. We also have Luxemburg saying, for example, that women, although they didn't have in the 19th century the right to vote or the right to officially participate politically, they did participate because they were going to assemblies, because they were speaking to other people, because they were delivering pamphlets. So this idea that not everything that is recognized, that is real, is officially recognized by the state or by the formal law, and we can challenge it, although the situation is hostile. And then I would like to conclude basically just speaking a little bit about it, and we can discuss it later. In this way, that they understood art as a social practice and capable of enabling social change. In the case of Luxemburg, we see that she acknowledged that the possibility of reading and critically understanding Tolstoy, for example, would be a really, really nice pedagogical tool for young people, because reading Tolstoy, people can embrace with the idea of empathy, or can see how individuals can act although the structure or the conditions are bad, for example. So Luxemburg thought that there was a link between the development of Russian citizenship and Tolstoy's novels. So she basically was saying that art and literature were social practice with the ability of changing, and the ideas could change things. Also, we have Märten, who basically talks about proletarian culture. This is a really, really fuzzy concept that everyone uses, but basically for her, proletarian culture meant the idea of being alive, of seeking the authenticity in life in a context in which they were basically all working zombies, right? So this idea that we need to use art as a tool to engage with ourselves and emancipate. There is a really nice article of Märten talking about how workers should also engage in journals, for example, and write for journals and having the possibility to set the agenda, the media agenda in journals, and talking about what was important for them. Also, we have a quote of Luxemburg, really interested in a journal that some prostitutes were developing. So all these self-organization practices that could produce everything new and that could make people really engage with their citizenship were really of interest of these three authors. And finally, I would say that the way in which Hannah Höch tried to use art as a social practice capable of enabling social change is basically trying to, as Brecht did, but also as someone claimed that Tolstoy also did, introducing a sort of distance between the imagined world and the real world. So basically, when she is doing her photomontage, we see how she tries to challenge the relationships that we conceive as natural, like gender, but also historical causality, and tries to show us something new. So her idea was basically use art to enable political imagination and to use the transformative power of Dadaism to show that things could be done differently. And if you read some of Hannah Höch's writings talking about her own practice of photomontage, she basically uses Verfremdung, which is the same word that Brecht used to talk about the technique that she was developing, and it's basically the same word that a lot of people who were creating at that time and were trying to introduce this distance and, as Märten would think, to awake workers in order to realize of their situation were using. So Hannah Höch, when talking about fantastic art, has this really nice quote in which she basically says, okay, this idea of introducing fantasy in art, of not trying to mere describe the historical reality, but think about alternative worlds, is not an escape. So it's not a way of escaping reality, but it's an offensive, because we really confront the world that we have with the world that could be. So for all of these three authors, basically art was a way of transforming society. And also we have to have clear in mind that basically for them, the democratization of art production, so the possibility of everybody would be able to create art and to achieve greatness in art, wherever they think greatness was about, and to understand art basically demands the democratization of social life. Although, of course, these three authors believe that in the meantime, a lot of things could be done, so they were not absolutely pessimistic about their own context. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies. A quick reminder about how to stay connected. You can find us on Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and you can also watch the presentations on YouTube. The podcast is available on all the major platforms. Please download, share, and most importantly, subscribe. See you next time.